What you just watched between Senator Tim Kaine and Secretary Marco Rubio is one of those exchanges that reveals far more beneath the surface than the words alone suggest. This wasn't merely about Afrikaner farmers or refugee policy, or a bureaucratic decision buried in an executive order. It was about whose suffering the government chooses to see, whose pain gets political attention, and how selective empathy can be weaponized to further an ideological narrative. Senator Kaine began by laying down a concrete, factual foundation. The Trump administration had not only paused but effectively dismantled the United States refugee infrastructure. This isn't speculation. Funding was cut, grants were terminated, long-standing partnerships with the Catholic Church, Lutheran Services, HIS, and other refugee resettlement organizations were shut down. A system built over decades to protect the vulnerable was intentionally frozen. And into that vacuum, into that deliberately restricted humanitarian landscape, the administration carved out one and only one fast-tracked exception: white Afrikaner farmers from South Africa. That is the heart of Kaine's point. Not whether any individual Afrikaner had a tough experience. Lots of people around the world face danger. Kaine's question was, why did this administration build a special refugee lane exclusively for this group while shutting the door on nearly everyone else? Rubio's response wasn't policy. It wasn't data. It wasn't even a serious engagement with the statute. Instead, he shifted immediately into a narrative that has long circulated in far-right media ecosystems: the idea that white farmers in South Africa are the world's most persecuted group. A claim that has been repeatedly debunked by international monitors, human rights organizations, South African courts, and even the South African government itself, whose agriculture minister is literally an Afrikaner political leader. Kaine tried to pull Rubio back to earth. Are Afrikaner farmers more persecuted than Uyghurs facing genocide? More persecuted than Rohingya fleeing mass ethnic cleansing? More persecuted than political prisoners in Cuba and Venezuela? More endangered than Afghans whose families were hunted down after assisting the U.S. military? Rubio could not answer yes to any of those. But he also would not say no. Because if he said no, the entire justification for this special carve-out collapses. So what did he do? He fell back on a sweeping, convenient talking point. The United States can choose whoever it wants. Which is legally true in the broadest sense. But Kaine wasn't asking about legality. He was asking about fairness. Should refugee law apply evenly? Should fear of persecution be judged consistently? Should skin color play no role in determining who is allowed to flee to safety? Rubio couldn't say yes. He also wouldn't say no. He sidestepped it over and over, eventually implying that prioritizing certain groups, even along racialized lines, is acceptable if the administration believes it serves national interest. And here's the deeper implication Kaine was highlighting. The Trump-era refugee policy wasn't grounded in humanitarian principles. It was grounded in political identity. It favored people whose story fit a particular ideological narrative: white victims abroad, supposedly abandoned by a black-led South African government, while shutting the door on refugees from Africa, the Middle East, Central America, and Asia, even those who faced actual genocide, torture, and war. Kaine then did something crucial. He brought in history. He reminded Rubio that, during apartheid, when South African blacks were literally second-class citizens under state violence, the U.S. never created a special refugee program for them. We have created special pathways before, but always for entire persecuted groups facing systemic oppression: Soviet Jews, Vietnamese refugees, Cubans fleeing communism. Never have we singled out a relatively privileged group from a democratic nation and elevated them above millions facing far worse conditions. By putting that history on the table, Kaine exposed the selective morality behind this policy. It wasn't about all lives mattering. It was about a political agenda disguised as humanitarian concern. Then came the real turning point. Kaine asked Rubio whether he was comfortable with the idea that refugee protections could vary based on race. Rubio accused Kaine of making it about color. But Kaine wasn't injecting race. It's already the framework this special program was built upon. The administration didn't hide it. The justification they used publicly was based on racialized narratives of farm attacks, Narratives that human rights groups themselves have warned are exaggerated, politicized, and weaponized by far-right groups globally. What Kaine did was force Rubio to confront the moral inconsistency. And Rubio flat-out refused to say that U.S. refugee policy should be applied fairly and evenly. He repeatedly framed fairness as optional, subordinate to national interest, a phrase that has historically been used to justify discriminatory immigration policies, from the Chinese Exclusion Act to the national origins quota system of the 1920s. What viewers need to understand here is that Kaine wasn't just arguing about Afrikaner farmers. He was exposing the deeper ideological project behind Trump-era immigration policy. Prioritize white, Christian, ideologically aligned immigrants, while shutting out non-white, non-Christian, war-torn, politically inconvenient refugees. That's why Kaine kept returning to the statute. Refugee law is meant to be neutral, protecting people based on fear of persecution, not political identity, not race, and not a narrative crafted by alt-right influencers. It also matters that Kaine raised this at a moment when global displacement is at record highs. Tens of millions are fleeing war, famine, climate disasters, and political repression. And during that historic crisis, the Trump administration didn't expand capacity. They slashed it down to almost zero, then made a single exception aligned with an ideological talking point. If we want a refugee system that reflects American values, fairness, compassion, rule of law, then we have to call out the ways it is being manipulated. Kaine's questions did exactly that. He tore through the rhetoric and revealed what was really happening: the government selectively shaping refugee policy not based on need or law, but based on political storytelling. This exchange is a reminder that oversight isn't just about catching mismanagement. It's about confronting the narratives that shape policy. If the public doesn't challenge these narratives, they quietly become accepted truth. If we want a refugee policy rooted in justice, one that treats people equally regardless of race or religion, then we need leaders who are willing to ask hard questions the way Senator Kaine did. Democracy requires vigilance, and moments like this prove why engaged citizens matter. If you want more deep dive analyses like this, breakdowns that go beyond the surface and expose the historical and political stakes, make sure to subscribe, stay engaged, and keep questioning the narratives presented to you. Democracy only survives when we all stay informed and involved.